Well, good afternoon, everyone, to everyone joining us in North America, and good evening to those of you joining us from Europe. My name is Jim Ambuske. I'm a senior historian and producer at Art2 Studios, the podcast division of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University here in Northern Virginia. I'm also the co-chair of the Research Advisory Committee for Patrick Henry's Red Hill, which was the last home of the Voice of the Revolution here in Brookneal, Virginia. I'm delighted today to be joined by author and historian Flora Fraser to talk about her new biography of Flora MacDonald. But before we get started, I do want to issue a few words of thanks to our sponsors for today's program. First up goes, of course, to Red Hill. Patrick Henry's Red Hill, as I said, is the last home of Patrick Henry, the critically important Virginia revolutionary who did so much in part to lead the nation to independence in the 1770s. I also want to say thank you very much to Virginia Humanities, a huge and very important humanities program and foundation here in Virginia. Their financial support is underwriting what's called Red Hill Rediscovered, which is helping produce talks like we are today to bring you the latest history and research to the public. And also, I want to say thanks to my own studio, Art2 Studios here at George Mason University. We're making a number of podcasts, including Your Most Obedient and Humble Servant, hosted by Catherine Garrett. And later this fall, we'll be rolling out the podcast series Worlds Turned Upside Down, A History of the American Revolution, hosted and written by me in conjunction with my colleagues here at George Mason. We're very excited to have Flora Fraser here join us in a second. And all of you watching on Facebook and YouTube, please know that we want you to be part of the conversation. You'll be able to ask questions later in the second half of the program by typing in your questions on Facebook or YouTube. And we please do submit early and submit often so we can begin thinking about some of the questions that you have for Flora as we talk about the life of the Jacobite heroine and American anti-revolutionary Flora MacDonald. But with that, let's get our program started. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome to the screen Flora Fraser. Flora is a historian of the 18th century. She has written numerous books, more than I ever will, and they're always a pleasure to read. And she is also author of books from the family of George III to the family of George and Martha Washington, the latter of which won her the 2016 George Washington Book Prize at my place of former employment, George Washington's Mount Vernon. Flora, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a delight to see you again.
A pleasure to be here with you, Jim, and exciting to talk about a particular item in the collection of Patrick Henry's Red Hill.
Indeed, and that's a great tease that we'll get to here in just a few moments. But Flora, where are you coming from this evening?
I'm here in London, and it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. And for once, I have to say, it's nice weather, no rain.
Same here in the United States. It's bright and sunny outside, which makes for a great day for a talk. We're going to talk about Flora MacDonald in a second, but you and I were very fortunate to meet many years ago in, of all places, Windsor Castle, as we were part of a program called the Georgian Papers program that allowed us to go into the round tower there at Windsor Castle and rifle through the papers of the Georgian kings. And as we get started talking about Flora MacDonald, I wonder if you wouldn't take a moment to reflect on that experience and what that was like working in that particular archive.
Yes, it was a most wonderful program, both for us and our colleagues working in the 18th century field, but also the program was digitizing the Georgian king's papers. So from George I through George II, George III, George IV, and then William IV. And you can now anyone can go on the Georgian Papers program or access it through the Royal Collection Trust. And there you can pull up, in effect, a letter that George III wrote to Lord North about the American Revolution, or I mean, it's a tremendous resource, and it's wonderful that we have so many of those papers now digitized. But we were privileged to go in there and look around.
Indeed. And part of the reason you were there and part of the reason we first met is that you were hard at work on research for this book, Pretty Young Rebel, The Life of Flora MacDonald, and very fortunate to have the UK edition here that a colleague of mine brought back for me just after it came out in London last year. Tell us a little bit about Flora MacDonald. We're going to dig into her life pretty considerably over the course of our conversation today, but she's one of my favorite figures in Scottish and American history, and she has a lot of mythos surrounding her, but she was a real person who did pretty remarkable things. And let's start there. Who was Flora MacDonald? And I'll bring up a picture of her for you.
Sure. So she's a young Scottish gentlewoman, but living in a very remote part of Scotland, the Western Isles, or the Outer Hebrides, alternate names. And she's literally minding her own business and minding her brother's cattle, and sleeping out in a bothy, a kind of hut, shepherd's hut on the hill in the summer of 1746. And out of the blue, a fugitive prince, Bonnie Prince Charlie, presents himself to her and asks her to dress him up as her Irish maid, Betty Burke, and go with him across the sea to Skye, and out of the reach of redcoats, of Hanoverian officers who are seeking to capture him. He's just led what's known as the Rising of the 1745, a Stuart prince in exile. He comes over from Rome and leads a Highland army down towards London, where he hopes to claim the throne from George II. But in the end, he's pushed back up north, and at the Battle of Culloden outside Inverness, his army's defeated, and he flees to try and take ship back to France and the continent. And it's during that wandering that he comes to Flora, and so this very normal 24-year-old young woman has her life completely transformed when she agrees to dress him up as her Irish maid. And Bonnie Prince Charlie was 6 foot and had a very distinctive long Stuart face, which you can see the long oval. And so she and the clan chief's wife who helped her, they had to sew an enormous dress, but on top of that, they had to sew a very voluminous bonnet so as to hide this well-known face. And the song, of course, Speed, Bonny Boat, like a bird on the wing o'er the sea to Skye, that's the boat that takes Flora and Bonnie Prince Charlie from the Outer Hebrides to Skye. And it's now even more famous since that tune has become the theme tune for Outlander, which but it's a truly dangerous mission that she's on, to hand him over to another clan chief who who can then get him from Skye to the west coast, back to the west coast of Scotland. And indeed, that does occur. And he hides out for 3 months and finally gets back scot-free, if you like, to the continent. But Flora is taken prisoner down to London, and her life is, I mean, completely altered, and she's become overnight a celebrity, because although the Highland Army, these Scottish Highlanders who went with Bonnie Prince Charlie down to Edinburgh and then further south as far as Derby, although they fought against the king, in other words, they levied war against the king and so committed treason, Flora's treason was a different kind. She aided and abetted this fugitive prince. But these Highlanders were reasonably or unreasonably described by the Hanoverian officers and by the English as Jacobite rabble or vermin. But Flora had quite another reputation. And early on, one of her captors who took her, who seized her at her mother and stepfather's house on Skye, and then a long voyage by ship round the north coast of Scotland and down to London ensued. But this captor said, "What made you do this extremely dangerous mission, undertake this mission?" And she said, "I would have done the same for you had you been in distress." And this really captured the attention of both, if you like, society, London society, but also the normal, the less high society English, who hadn't, if you like, looked at it like that. And so this was a very surprising, and it was very important that she acted through clemency, motives of clemency, not loyalty to this exiled dynasty.
What I find particularly remarkable about that early period, and particularly the sources you're talking about, where she's being interrogated by her British captors first aboard the warship, and then, of course, in London, is how very politically astute she is, and as you say, as the her comments about why she did what she did, is both born out of a desire to do clemency, but also she was, I thought, very good at sort of reading the room. Tell us a little bit about your interest in doing a biography of Flora. That people have written about her before, Ruby MacLeod, Hugh Douglas, some others have done so. What drew you to this particular project?
Yeah, and they're all excellent books. And I grew up between London and Inverness, very close to Culloden. An ancestor of mine was one of these Jacobite chiefs. So Jacobite history was all around. I was named after Flora, as were many in the district. But I had, and I knew about Dr. Johnson and Boswell making their famous later tour when Flora's a matron in her 50s, has 7 children, and they visit her on Skye. And that was all, I thought, oh, I know this whole story. I mean, not that I was uninterested in it, but it was just like in my bones. And then I was looking for illustrations for my last book about the dual biography of George and Martha Washington. And in a sheaf of revolutionary images, Hamilton, Abigail Adams, Nathaniel Greene, I suddenly come across an engraving of Flora, which I know to date from the 1740s. The original painting is in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, and I think, what is Flora MacDonald doing in among these revolutionaries of the 1770s, the other side of the world? And then I remembered that she said to Dr. Johnson, "You were lucky to catch me. I'm off to America." And I I felt at once absolutely fascinated and also absolutely horrified at my own lack of curiosity, that as a teenager, as a young historian, I never thought to think, where did she go in America? And nor did I take in the date, which was Johnson visits in 1773. Anyway, so I find that, if you like, her principal area of operations, or she emigrates with her family to North Carolina, but that's not, as you know, Jim, the only colony state that she finds herself in during the Revolution. I think this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, not only do we have pure men, or a Jacobite in the 45, anti the king. And then we have, because her husband and sons and all her maternal relations did join loyalist militias. So now we have a sort of an anti-king when it would have been better to be a pro-king, and now we've got a pro-king when it would have been better to be an anti-king. And but that, of course, I thought was very fascinating. What made them plump for supporting the crown? And I think we can see very easily they'd only just arrived. They had no idea of the not only of the sort of power that was military power within these local militia in every colony that was being assembled, but I think also they were very aware of the power of the British Army, particularly, and Navy. And many of them had fought in the 7 Years' War, either in the French and Indian War or further off. So they had seen the British Crown defeat the French, the Spanish, and I think that as much, I mean, they just couldn't envisage that these people who they thought were, ragamuffins. And I think, but Jim, you know more about this than me, but I think I'm right that those Scots who settled earlier, say the 1740s, they do become patriots because they've seen not only the justice of the claims, but they've seen that this is a viable fighting force.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that you're right. In the 1730s and 1740s, there's this earlier wave of migration that takes place, and a lot of those folks do become patriots on the American side, in part because they kind of acclimated or seasoned, as they would have said in the 18th century, to American politics. But the folks like Flora and others who come later, who are leveraging the pathways and the connections that earlier generation forged, remain loyal to the crown. And I want to talk a little bit about her life on Skye preceding her immigration, because there's a whole lot of stuff going on besides the turmoil in the colonies, but there's a lot going on in Scotland that inspires the immigration. And I'll bring up this very famous portrait by Alan Ramsay. It was painted, I think, around 1747, if I recall, somewhere in
Yeah.
there. As you said, she becomes a famous in the wake of the Jacobite uprising for very curious reasons, and it's sort of contradictory or counterintuitive reasons. Can you tell us a little bit about her life on Skye between the uprising and her decision to immigrate with her family?
Yes. So when she's taken prisoner down to London, as she, I mean, she's very much taken up by London Jacobites, some of whom are very rich. And when there's a general amnesty, she goes back up to Skye with a purse, a dowry in effect, of £1,500, which I'd say you have to multiply by 100 for now. And then don't forget it went further in a relatively primitive island culture on Skye. They were very sophisticated in terms of their literature and learning, but it was not a place where it couldn't compare with the lowlands for genteel living, if you like. There was some, but the main thing it did, this money, was it went to pay for the long lease of a farm, or a tack as they called it, and this was where Flora and her husband, a very suitable husband, the son of a factor or land agent, they started their life and had, and as I say, had this family of 5 sons and 2 daughters. And this is the cottage. In fact, the farm is still there. Oddly, I mean, it's it's been pulled around, but the site is still there below this great landslip of a mountain, the Kerrang. The problem is that Alan, Flora's husband, he looks the part. I mean, Boswell says he looks the perfect Highlander, but he just he can't keep hold of money, and he has ideas, and he was he has ideas for improvement, 18th century improvements of the kind that George Washington and George Mason indeed successfully put in place. But Alan, he brings this kind of sheep and that kind of potato, but it all, and his father was an immensely successful factor or land agent for the MacDonald chief on Skye for 30 years. And within a few years, Alan is let go. And this fortune that Flora has brought Alan is dissipated at the same time. So there's Alan's poor management. That's one thing. Then the government legislation after the rising of the 1745 has divorced the clan chiefs from the clans and sent the chiefs south, sort of blackmailed some of them into educating their heirs in the south, i.e. London, Oxford, Cambridge. And so rather than go to Edinburgh, Glasgow, or Aberdeen universities, marry a Scottish, they stay in London, and then they ask, of course, for the rents to be put up. And so this is also going on. And in this 30 years that or sort of 25 years, that Flora and Alan are living on Skye. Not everyone is a bad manager like Alan, but everyone is feeling the these rents. When will these rents stop going up? And they're for long leases, but it makes it, they never know what it's going to be, what they're going to set the next time. And on top of that, just before Boswell and Samuel Johnson come, in fact, there's some very bad. There's the Black Spring, when the snow lay on the ground, i.e. the cattle starved, and then there was cattle disease and murrain. So there was some local, some sort of national, and some personal things which make their emigration, almost at that time when 500 at a time are going, inevitable. And Flora, not Alan, has taken care in the sort of years before to find places for all their sons in the Bengal army. And with Flora, you get really interesting female patronage, because she's often applying to a female patron, and she is the one who's making the applications, not her husband. So the female agency in her story is quite interesting. But then, of course, in Scotland, where many went off for long years in the 7 Years' War, or the women did run things at home quite often. So it wasn't that surprising, but it's notable that she's the one doing the asking.
Well, I've always enjoyed reading those correspondence. They're good friends with a man named John Mackenzie of Delvin, and a lawyer in Edinburgh, who's if anybody's out there who wants to do a book about a very prominent lawyer who seems to have his hand in everything, that's your guy. His papers are at the National Library of Scotland. But you're right, she writes to him and says, her youngest son, Johnny, like, he needs a place. Would you look after him? What can you do for my other older sons? It's remarkable how she is the one driving the ship in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And she doesn't, I think, she's sustained in difficult times by a strong Presbyterian faith. And so you never see her complaining about her husband. The most you'd get is her saying that she's done her best for the House of Stuart and the House of Hanover, and precious little she got by either of them.
Well, tell us then about the immigration to North Carolina, and why North Carolina. Here is a map that you kindly supplied to us. This is one of the more famous maps from 1770. Why the Carolinas?
So the Carolinas have one particular, if you like, aspect to them which makes Scots keen to emigrate there. This longleaf pine in North Carolina supplies the pitch and tar for Royal Navy ships, for the hull and for the ropes. And so this is it's a timber colony, if you like. And that, I think, could originally be that's an attraction. It means there'll be work. But in fact, Flora and her family from Skye and others from the west coast of Scotland and other islands, in fact, they make for a particular, you might call it a kind of Scottish Eden, Cross Creek, which is now long been Fayetteville. But that's way up the Cape Fear River. And the reason for that, I mean, what they're aiming above all to do is to buy. They want to buy, they want to own their homes. That's what they're getting away from, is the rents. And they, and these very encouraging letters are coming back from those who have settled in Cross Creek and in this area. There are richer Scots merchants have along the coast. I mean, not New Bern, Wilmington, but these are folk who have sold up everything they've got, and they haven't got very much, and they're buying what they can afford. So they have to go way up and away from, if you like, the many things, including the timberlands. And when they do effectively what they did on Skye. They cattle is their main way of life. They're breeding cattle. And it's quite, I mean, primitive, as you know, Jim. They're sort of chopping down trees, and the cattle have to kind of chew the stumps down. I mean, it's subsistence farming, but they're happy, as Flora said. We lived comfortably for a year, and obviously this settlement, Cross Creek. I mean, you read the claims of the inhabitants of Cross Creek, who then came back to the UK having been displaced, and their claims are really fascinating. They tell you about a way of life in which there was, Murdo MacLeod, the surgeon, and it's all there. You've got absolutely everything, and you've got the sawmill, and it's there were some of the Campbells, the Argyll people, had gone out there earlier, so they're not making it new, but it's it feels, I think, for that moment, as though this, even though Flora said, I leave my home with real regret, I think, it was possible to feel we did the right thing, and we can make a go of it.
Oh, for sure. And certainly North Carolina becomes a very Scottish place in the 1760s and 1770s. As you were working on this project, Flora, I wonder, did you have the opportunity to travel to these different places where, I mean, the story we're talking about, of course, is transatlantic in scope, but it involves places as different as Skye and London and Edinburgh and North Carolina?
Yes, I was very lucky that I had traveled up the Cape Fear River and to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she was also, and to all the South Uist, where she was that was her native land. And I was able to do this. I mean, I wasn't able, I did it, and did all the research in different archives before COVID. So I would have hated, not to have been to, I don't know. I mean, she was only a winter in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but it was really important to me to go there and see it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how she actually ends up in Halifax. They immigrate, and I've never been able to quite figure this out. Was it late 1773 that they left, or 1774?
I think it's late. I think it's the autumn of 74.
So
which
right,
I think it wouldn't have been late autumn. I think they'd have had to go, because of the weather. They'd have had to go September-ish.
So they are arriving in the aftermath of the wake of the Coercive Acts, what the colonists call the Intolerable Acts, which shuts down the port of Boston in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. essentially limits the town meetings in Massachusetts and provokes a response from the colonists. So, and we're still a little bit away from the actual outbreak of war, but there are choices that have to be made. And I think we've begun to talk about it a little bit, but is it your sense then that uh, the combination of the opportunity that they see in North Carolina, plus the fact, as you said, in Carolina they can own land, whereas in Skye they are beholden to a landlord who is racking their rents? Is it your sense then that the ability to hold on to the land is one of the kind of powerful motivators to remain loyal to Hanover?
Yeah, I mean, I think they want what they've obtained. These, I mean, in Flora and Alan's case, a couple of steadings, so sort of 2 farms, but I mean, we're talking steadings rather than plantations. Um, and I think that it was, I mean, they had gone through so much to get here. They also took quite some time to, all of them, not just they, but everyone took a lot of time choosing the the site of that, the which plot they were going to buy, and it they're dug deep in a short space of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they couldn't, I mean, I honestly think they couldn't believe that that everything that they did. You see, they were such a long way away,
Mm-hmm.
such a long way away from Wilmington and New Bern, where the action was going on. If they'd been there, they would have, but as it was, you get this rather sort of rash young royal governor who's making a lot of claims to government back in London about, I've got these marvelous Highlanders who've, I mean, Flora's son-in-law, yes, he'd been 23 years in the Marines and had been Manila and all over in the 7 Years' War. But I mean, Alan, who Josiah Martin, this royal governor, so rated, I mean, Alan had been at most a lieutenant doing garrison duty at Fort Augustus in the 45. I mean, it was like, I mean, I'm not saying they wouldn't have done if they had managed to get to the coast and receive the arms from, obviously they all knew how to use arms, not that, but these were not military men. I mean, they had the whole sort of, the government had been very insistent that,
Mm-hmm.
effectively these clan chiefs standing armies were disbanded. So so they really, I think Josiah Martin, the royal governor, got things confused because he thought that any Highlander, because these Highlanders, yes, there'd been vermin in the 1745 rising, but in the 7 Years' War, they'd won a terrific reputation as Highland, both officers and ranks. And I think he confused it and thought that all Highlanders were naturally great fighters.
Well, I think you're right. Josiah Martin is one of my favorite figures from the Revolutionary period. He's about 30 years old when the war breaks
Yeah,
out. So, he's already achieved more than me by that point of being a royal governor at that age. But he's completely out of his depth, we might say. And as you rightly say, a lot of folks have this sense that Highlanders have this sort of innate savagery, as they would use it, and they, of course, during the 7 Years' War at the Battle of Quebec and other
yeah,
places where they perform remarkable feats on this sort of the shock troops of the empire. So, if they're doing that there, then well, surely all of the folks in the back country of North Carolina are the same. But as you said, a lot of the action's taking place in the ports, but the war does come to the back
Yes.
country to Cross Creek.
Yeah.
What happens and who's involved? And tell us about a place about the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge.
Yes. So, I mean, Flora and her family are right at the beginning directly involved because her son Ranald, who's in the Marines, is he's in one of the companies that go out from Boston to take on those ornery colonists at Lexington and Concord, and he gets wounded, which I find amazing. And then a month later, he's at Bunker Hill. But that's obviously, we don't know for sure that they ever knew that until much later. I mean, things came so late. But yes, so Josiah Martin, this governor down on the coast, hatches a plan with Allen and other leaders of the Cross Creek community that they will come march down to the coast, and arms will be and ammunition will be brought in synchronized to meet them at the coast down from New York by ship. So this terrific armed force will then be at the disposal of Josiah Martin. So I think it's really one of the most extraordinary sort of, what do you call it, musters there's ever been. They're carpenters and they're cattle farmers, and anyway, they all there are two regular British Army officers who come to sort of lead this troop, but they get together all the things you need, like barrels of pork, and I think it was the surgeon brings 2 medicine chests, which are, because of course they claim for them much later after the war. You see just how expensive medicine was in those days. But anyway, they set off, and apparently Flora rides a white palfrey up and down, urging them on, which is certainly folklore still in Fayetteville and around, even if it never happened. It's I mean, certainly she was extremely famous when she came among them, and Dr. Johnson's journey to the Western Isles had just been published in the United States, in Virginia, I think, and it says, and the advertisement reads, Dr. Samuel Johnson's meeting with the celebrated Flora MacDonald. I mean, this is she's an iconic figure, I suppose. Anyway, they march down so as to meet the warships with their cargo of arms. Unfortunately, the Patriots set on them, or rather, there's a kind of Highland charge across a bridge. I think it's the last Highland charge ever to take place, not in Scotland, but in North Carolina, and with sort of St. God for Harry and St. George and broadswords, or King George and broadswords probably was the war cry. And anyway, the Patriots completely, they've this sort of, and this is Moores Creek with the bridge, and the Patriots who go on to be very much the governor, etc., of North Carolina. They've greased the few planks that they leave on the bridge, and they've removed other planks. Anyway, it's a scene of kind of devastation, but not actually of much death, but 500 prisoners. That's all this Highland Corps are taken. And the leaders, if you like, the ringleaders, including Flora's husband and one of her sons, are sent out of the colony. And Flora's husband's now in the Philadelphia jail, and then out on a kind of parole in Reading, Pennsylvania for 2 years. And Flora, the servants, they have the system, certainly in Cross Creek, and certainly it's true of Flora's family, they have indentured servants rather than enslaved labor, whereas on the coast you'd get a different system. But just, it's so particular, this little Scottish Eden. Anyway, the servants, who they may have brought from home with them, if you see what I mean, or they may have picked up in the colony. Anyway, they run off. The horses are taken. The silver's taken, and Flora sort of ducks and dives, as does her daughter, who's got 4 children. And so there's a sort of, I mean, the loyalists or the dependents of these loyalists don't actually leave the colony, but they're kind of waiting to be rescued. And eventually Alan is exchanged for a continental officer in New York, and Flora's son-in-law, who's an illegitimate son of the MacLeod chief on Skye, but a favored one. So luckily he's got money. Anyway, he's basically the person on whom Flora can rely, because he's, he was the only one who didn't buy when they got to North Carolina. And and there are references to Flora's son-in-law and daughter's house. They just rented it, and it was full of packing cases, because he wasn't going to buy, because he saw trouble coming. He was
Certainly.
right. Yeah. So he then brings Alexander MacLeod brings his mother-in-law Flora and his wife Annie and the children to New York.
And eventually they make their way to Nova Scotia, or she does at least, and it goes back to Skye. But one of the fascinating things that has a direct connection to Patrick Henry's Red Hill, remarkably, is this a part of this China set here. And I should say I was very fortunate to receive a fellowship from Red Hill many years ago when I was finishing my dissertation, and I went down for a visit in Brookneal, Virginia, which is in Southwest Virginia. I walk into the museum and I see this tea set, and it's quite lovely, and I'm admiring the patterns. And then I read the label, and it says Flora MacDonald's tea set. What in the world, and how does it get there? What do we know about this particular tea set?
Well, I mean, I think it's when they left, Flora's, I mean, Alan's claim says that Flora came out with, I think it's £40 in money. So everything is, there are, it was either, there were things that were obviously taken. She refers to night robbers. But I think with the tea set, I don't think a night robber would have wanted a tea set. I think this is something that she would have left behind or given to to a friend when leaving, because that seems to be the case also with some shoe buckles which are in the North Carolina Museum. And I think this is much more likely to be the way that I mean, the night robbers or burglars wanted money, silver if they could, sell it, horses, etc. And I think the fact that it's so well preserved is that it's been handed from. I mean, I don't think we have. I mean, I know there's some documentation, but there isn't. I don't think documentation to show how obviously how it came into the Patrick Henry's Red Hill.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always believed that these were things which, there was a certain amount of time when she was preparing to leave the colony, when we know we have the correspondence between her son-in-law, who's waiting with a merchant ship to bring her. And I think during that time, she's disposing of things she can't take. But whenever I look at these and I think of her saying, "We lived comfortably for a year," this would have been part of her comfort, because a tea set, obviously in the 18th century, you had tea after your dinner. You didn't have lunch, you had breakfast, and then you had dinner. And then after dinner, you set out the tea table, and it was very much a female preserve. But men would come. I mean, the men of the party would come to be given their cup of tea. And earlier on, there were no handles for the cups, but by now, it's evolving into the kind of tea set that that we recognize. They were sort of shallow bowls before, but she certainly liked, she liked an elegant way of life, and I think she was. She's petite. She's always well dressed, and as I said when I was talking about Skye, that there was some gentility, and I think it's we're not talking great stone houses or palaces on Skye or in Cross Creek, but when you read the loyalist claims, you've got fine material, you've got furniture, you've got. I mean, I think at this Cheeks Creek property, I think this is a souvenir of a life that she had worked very hard to get, and to make, civilized, gentrified.
It is a remarkable piece of material culture. It's a remarkable relic of you might say a revolution in Scotland and a revolution in America. And we've got a few minutes left for audience questions. If anyone out there on Facebook or YouTube has a question, please type those in now. And Flora, while we wait to see if anybody out there has a query, what do you see as Flora MacDonald's legacy in Scotland and America?
Yes, I think her legacy in Scotland is that she's she has uh, um, the character that Scots so admire, in that she was courageous in the face of danger, but also she endured, and she negotiated whatever was thrown at her. She did her best. And I think that's really admired in Scotland. Some say, yes, she was a typical, Hebridean woman. But I think it chimes in with how she's seen in the Scottish diaspora, which is she she really exemplifies Scotland and those Scots who have left Scotland and gone out into the world. And it's a it's this canniness, at how to the canny way in which she negotiates everything that's thrown at her, but with a great deal of charm, which I think gets her a long way.
I think you're absolutely right, and I'm not seeing any audience questions. So Flora, I'll ask you now that you're on your book tour with this book about Flora MacDonald, but what are you working on now?
Well, I've just started, really just started a book, Nelson on Shore and at Sea, about Horatio, Lord Nelson. And I was sort of drawn to him after writing about Washington, who in a sense is a character so difficult to know. And Nelson, I've always been fascinated by Nelson. Again, he has some very, very obvious flaws, vanity. He is, has a genius at sea. But I sort of been feeling that he's rather forgotten in the 18th century world. There are very, very good books written by our best naval historians here and in America, which benefit greatly, if you like, people who have a real understanding of naval history and the sea. But this is a book to kind of put him back in a way in that quite central place he occupied in the 18th century, on shore as well as at sea. And I think there are interesting aspects. Now we have so much more data about the British West Indies, where he married the niece of a sugar planter. And so, we now have Nelson undoubtedly benefited from the slave plantations on Nevis, and then later, I'm very interested by his. But you also see a side of Nelson when he's out there, when he's this young, sort of ornery captain who hasn't got it together yet and is fighting with absolutely everyone. And then later, this, his band of brothers, these captains who were so important to him, and they have, they're not, it's less of an English story than it might be. You have, there are a lot of Scots in there. And then the part that I do know something of, his love affair with Emma Hamilton, and his and the birth of their child, illegitimate child, Horatia, because my first book was A Life of Emma Hamilton.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to that book putting into port in the near future. But in the meantime, folks, of course, pick up a copy of Pretty Young Rebel. Flora, thank you very much for joining me. I hope to see you in person at some point, either for a cup of tea or for a wee dram.
For sure.
And
thank you, Jim. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And as we close out today, just once again want to thank Patrick Henry's Red Hill, Virginia Humanities, and R2 Studios for supporting this talk. And this talk is being recorded and will be on our social media channels. So if you'd like to watch it again, please do so. And thanks, everyone, and have a great evening.